Migration is a global phenomenon, but every world region has their particular migration needs and challenges. In order to get a full picture of the migration situation, we need to look at the regions and connect the dots from there. My name is Elisabeth Minkoff, and joining me today is Martijn Ploym, Director for Dialogues and Cooperation at ICMPD, who is supervising 6 ICMPD regions where we have 30 offices. Dear Martijn, great to have you here and a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here and happy to contribute to this podcast series.
You're joining me now remote from our Turkey office, and it has been a week since the earthquake, and a few days ago you made the journey there. Can you share your impressions and what is the current situation on the ground?
Thank you very much. I've been here now since a few days, meeting with my colleagues in the offices in Istanbul and in Ankara, who have been very much affected by the earthquake, and of course meeting with the national authorities. All of them are working very hard to address the impact of the earthquake, but everyone does so in a state of shock. We now know that more than 40,000 people have died, 80,000 people injured, but it's also clear that this figure will multiply dramatically. Even estimates go very, very high. I don't want to speculate, but we will see in the coming weeks that this figure will be much higher than ever expected. And of course, it took place in a region where some 13 million people live, but also 1.8 million migrants live there. And many Syrians under temporary protections. There have been quite a lot of other migrants also living in that region. So the earthquake affected Turkish society, but also Syrians under temporary protection especially. And that will have an impact now, and it will have an impact in the longer term.
How is, looking at ICMPD, how is the office and the operations in the office affected at the moment?
Well, what we have tried to do initially is to provide emergency support to our partners, the Presidency for Migration Management, but also others. We provided some support to them. Now we are looking at how we can adjust the activities of the various projects that we are having to make sure that they can contribute to the functioning of the national authorities in delivering their services. We are not a humanitarian organization. We did provide some small scale support, but our aim is to make sure that the mid and long term, the Presidency of Migration Management, the Director General for Provincial Administration, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can continue to do their work and do it in the best way possible. And to also prepare them for the different scenarios with regard to internal displacement within Turkey, but also possible movements, for example, back to Syria, but also onwards to Europe. And then here, of course, there's a lot of concerns. There's a lot of speculation, and we want to avoid contributing to the speculation. Many people, the fact that they lost their houses, they lost loved ones, their first thought in their mind is not, let's move to Europe. Their first thought of their mind is to survive. Their first thought is to make sure that they can cope, and to be in the country of origin, in your own country, offers the security that they need. So the first care is to make sure that people feel comfortable at home.
Right. It's absolutely shocking indeed. Nevertheless, I would like to come back to the general topic of today's podcast, let's say. So it's important to understand that we set up our podcast prior to this tragedy. And the topic today is that we're talking about the different regions. And of course, we will come back to Turkey, and Syria is one of the priority regions at ICMPD a bit later on in a few minutes. But it would be great if you could give us a little bit of a general idea of how we at ICMPD see and understand regions, and why migration in the regions, or should be looked at something that happens in the regions in the first place.
Thank you very much. First of all, we record this podcast roughly 1 week before the 1 year since the invasion of Russia into Ukraine took place. which caused one of the biggest movements recorded both within Ukraine as well as from Ukraine elsewhere. The war is continuing, and we will come back later to the impact of that. But I think it's important to realize that we are recording this podcast on a very specific, particular circumstances. We have the earthquake in Turkey. We have the horrible situation in Ukraine, where we need to pay a special attention to. As ICMPD, we call ourselves a regional organization, a European organization, a regional organization. That doesn't mean that we don't work globally. We work globally, but migration to the largest extent takes place within regions, within West Africa, within the Med, within the Silk Road region, within Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and of course within West Balkan, Turkey region, or between these regions, from the Silk Road regions via West Balkan, Turkey to Europe. So we believe that while there is the Global Compact for Migration and other global frameworks, cooperation, solutions, approaches need a regional approach. And that's why we have established the organization the way we have, setting up a number of priority regions within which and we look for cooperation and approaches to address various migration challenges and look for the opportunities that migration can offer to migrants and to countries alike.
You're dealing with countries like Ghana, like Kazakhstan, like Pakistan, like Tunisia. All countries are completely different and have different sort of challenges that they are dealing with. How do you cope, and how many days how many days a year do you have to be on the road? Really, how important is it for you to be also on the ground?
I would choose the word cooperation and not dealing. So we are cooperating indeed with 70, 80 countries on a very regular basis via the migration dialogues, which we support a secretariat, both between Europe, West Africa, and Europe and East Africa, with Europe and the Silk Routes, and Europe and Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as well as via numerous capacity building programs. Now, that of course makes you realize that there's a lot of differences between individual countries. Every country, like every migrant, basically has individual stories and realities. So the cooperation between Europe and Ghana, or between Niger and Nigeria, within Central Asia, or between South Caucasus countries and Europe. So there's different constellations everywhere. They need a deep understanding of the different circumstances and realities, and also the migration history and existing migration networks. As ICPD, we have very experienced staff in all those regions, in our headquarters. And for me, it's important, however, to go there to visit counterparts, roughly 100 and 120 days a year. I'm traveling to be able to also convey the messages that there is different expectations. There is not one fit for all solution, but also to convey the message that there is actually many opportunities for close cooperation between individual European countries, between the EU and those countries, but also between the countries in the region. And we see ourselves, let's say, as a facilitator of this type of cooperation.
Now, if you're looking at the past experience of yours, 25 years roughly, if I'm right.
Correct. I started 1st of April 1998 as an intern.
As of 2017, you then you took on the current role that you have, and the goal was then to set up regional representations. Can you say a little bit more about sort of ICMPD and how they dealt with this whole regionalization process and how you approached it?
Indeed, when we decided to change the approach of ICMPD and to go deeper into the field and to set up regions, the argumentation was like I described before, to have specialization and cooperation on regional level, because we truly believe that is where you can find the best opportunities for facilitating cooperation, for helping countries to improve their capacity to professionalize the work that they are doing, and to be the best partner both within that region as well as between that region and, for example, European and ICMPD member states. So the whole thinking process was like that. If we establish these regional offices, regional approaches, we will be better as an organization to deliver what we want to do, and that is helping our partners to do their work better by helping them to modernize, to professionalize both partners within Europe as well as outside of Europe.
And now, speaking more concrete, where are those hubs now and why are they set up in those places?
Well, we have six identified regions. One is the Eastern Europe and Central Asia, covering basically Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We have the Silk Route regions, which covers countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka. We have the Turkey Western Balkan region, clearly what that covers. We have the Mediterranean covering North Africa, Jordan, and Lebanon. We have the West Africa office, which is based in Abuja, covering the whole of West Africa, basically the ECOWAS region. And then we have a Pan-African program which covers the cooperation between Europe and ICMPD and the African Union Commission and all the wider African programs.
And now all of these regions are publishing once a year the so-called ICMPD regional migration outlooks. That means they identify the key issues that will be relevant for each specific regions. If you were to look at the things that those regions have identified as a common problems or issues, what would come to your mind?
Well, there's quite a number of especially this year, of common issues. There is the question, of course, of increased prices, inflation, but also linked in some regions to food insecurity. There is the increased realization of the importance of global warming, natural disasters like the earthquake here, global warming, and the impact of that leading to disasters, both slow running and emergency situations. The floodings in Pakistan are an example, but of course the desertification and taking place in large parts of the Sahel, the droughts in different countries. So that's a big impact which we see everywhere. But we also see other aspects like new technologies, the impact of artificial intelligence, not only on how we can do our work, but also on how people can get the information, how the work that ministries of interior use artificial intelligence to, for example, do refugee status determination. We see also this aspect. We see different situations in countries that we can see as a reaction to some of the trends that I just mentioned. On certain levels, you see a further nationalization of approaches. There is the international cooperation is under threat within the UN system. You have certain challenges, but also on regional level, you see that some countries rather would like to go for it alone. This, of course, is something that we need to counter, especially on the topics such as migration. Not the only topic, but especially a topic like migration. We have to work together internationally. There's always movement between countries. There's movement through countries. So international cooperation is essential, and we strive to support that continuously.
And now, if we are looking at those countries individually, we are now at the beginning still of the year. And if you look at what has been sort of thought to happen in the beginning, and now, is this something that, okay, I mean, the earthquake is quite obvious, something that was not foreseen, I guess. How about other topics, maybe things that we don't necessarily have on the sort of daily European perspective agenda that happened in the regions that you think has already become relevant this year and has already started to drive new themes surrounding migration?
Well, I'm not sure whether we should go already via the individual regions, because it's different per region, where we can see there is like we expected last year, saw, especially vis-a-vis Europe, it's quite a drastic increase in the number of asylum applications, secondary applications, and we can expect that to continue this year. What we will see is in certain regions an increase of migratory pressures because of the livelihood problems that many people have, economic situation in a number of countries. So we see already some movements there. But again, I think that there is huge differences per region. So I think it's better we can look into the individual regions and say, okay, what's happening there, and be clearer what's happened.
Let's do that. You can pick and start from the region that you think is maybe most relevant at the moment.
The question, which of course is apart from the earthquake, we come to that later, is on everyone's mind, especially in Europe, is of course the situation in Ukraine. The invasion by Russia into Ukraine has a huge impact, obviously, on Ukrainians within the country. Pushed millions of them out. We had, for the first time ever in Europe, tested a new system offering temporary protection to millions of Ukrainians, giving them specific rights in a very fast way. We should also look at the impact that the war had on movements from, for example, Russian citizens towards neighboring countries in the South Caucasus, in Central Asia. Also here, these movements, the Russians who left for many different reasons. Again, also here, it's both because they were against the war or because they just did not want to fight. There's many reasons, and that has had a major impact on the countries where they are now staying, positive as well as negative. It raised prices. It created less labor opportunities for local population. Many of them also, let's say, from Central Asia, South Caucasus, are not much inclined anymore to move to Russia. But it also has had a lot of positive inflow of human and financial capital entering into those countries. So there has been double effects in that regard. I would like to raise one particular issue of concern, whether or not it can be called a migration issue, but it's the abduction and de facto movement of thousands of children from Ukraine to Russia. Of course, this is something which everyone is aware of it, and there is a high level of frustration how little can be done against it. But of course, also here we have to. This is something that will be there for years to come, and where we have to be able to see what the international community can do to bring those children home.
It would be interesting to look into this also from a migration perspective, how this was even possible.
It's a human perspective, a human rights perspective, a child rights perspective. There's so many components of this which make this horrible. Of course, we can qualify this as trafficking de facto, because children are being taken away against their will, and that is something that we cannot do much again at the moment, but it's something that has to not fall off the radar and just be accepted as also that happened. So it's from that perspective, I think we need to follow closely. From many perspectives, we need to follow closely what happens with the war in Ukraine. We have looked at a number of scenarios depending on how the war develops. Even if there would, let's say, be a rapid victory, what would that from Ukraine? Would that lead to massive return migration? What would be the impact? How can we prepare for that? Will it be a long, protracted, continuous war like what we see now? Many scenarios are there. All of them will have different impacts on Ukraine and also on migration. We also have to look at not maybe always directly related impact of the war, but it for sure has a contributing impact is on tensions between individual countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, whether that's in Central Asia or the South Caucasus, where we have seen increase of tension because Russia's focus is very much now, of course, on Ukraine. We're very conscious about the situation in Moldova. We have seen the resignation of the government just last week. We hope that the country remains stable and pro-European in its government, and that we can continue to support them. But again, we should not be losing sight of the importance of a stable Moldova also from a migration perspective. Of course, first of all, from a democratization and human rights perspective, but also from a migration perspective.
Anything else that you think is relevant for Eastern Europe and Central Asia?
Yeah, what I shortly mentioned, it's the changing labor migration landscape. Many of the countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia were dependent on either migration towards the Russian Federation or to Europe. And in both directions, this has become a little bit more complicated. First of all, because a large number of Ukrainian citizens are now in Europe and doing jobs that maybe somehow other urban migrants would have been doing from that region. And secondly, it has become much less, let's say, obvious and attractive and sometimes even dangerous to go as a migrant worker to Russia and to work there. So also here, this has a major impact on the possibility for labor migration from those regions. Again, on the other side, we see that due to the sanctions and how they have been implemented, there's now much more trade going via individual countries in Central Asia and South Caucasus towards Russia. We see new businesses being established by Russian citizens, which also offer employment for citizens in the region. So I don't think it's balanced out, but it's not just black and white. There's a lot of gray space on the impact on migration.
If you had to pick one headline for the Eastern Europe, Central Asia region, what would it be? I know it's quite challenging, but what would be the headline for this year?
The headline for this year is that we that we hope to see peace and peace on Ukraine's conditions, to make sure that people can go back to their country of origin, and that we make sure that that is not anymore the reason why people are forced to flee their home.
Now moving on to the next region, do you have anything specific in mind which you think is related? Otherwise, I think it would be interesting also to look at the Silk routes.
Yes, well, if we go indeed to the Silk Routes region, of course, the story of 2021 was the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the impact that had on the citizens of Afghanistan, which were already many people were fleeing from the country. The situation in Afghanistan is, of course, dramatic. The human rights, economic situation is very, very bad. At the same time, also the relations between Taliban and the neighboring countries is of course also challenging. We saw the attack in Pakistan on the mosque a few weeks ago. We have seen clashes at the border with Iran, with Central Asian neighbors. There is, of course, many Afghans still trying to leave, but cynically enough, the extreme dire situations have made it more difficult for people to leave because they just lack the money to pay the smugglers to move. There is work that we're doing with both, especially with Pakistan, but also with other countries to see whether we can support the countries to host also the Pakistani refugees that they have. At the same time, we have seen the challenging situation that Pakistan had with the massive floodings last year and the impact it had on the Pakistani population. There is very limited opportunity for people from the Silk Routes region, maybe with the exception of India, to have legal migration opportunities, labor migration opportunities in Europe. There is, of course, a lot of movement to the Gulf states, but that makes the migration as a voluntary choice very often extremely challenging. We see also that the impact, of course, of the war in Ukraine and the global price rise has also created problems in many of the countries in the Silk Routes region, whether we talk about Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran. So all of them have been affected. And of course, we see the developments and the situation in Iran, which also creates enormous tensions in the country and will also lead to maybe some longer term displacements from people who are just fleeing the oppression.
But there are currently no legal pathways for them.
I would never say there is no, but there is very limited. There's very limited legal pathways available under certain conditions. Student visa, some labor employment opportunities are there. That is broader. There is, of course, now so valid for all regions in many European countries, but also elsewhere, a recognition that there is a labor shortage in certain sectors. And therefore, we should try to focus on also creating legal pathways. Of course, here the challenge is the match between skills and education and labor market needs, and this mismatched needs to be addressed in order for this to be successful. And this, we talk about recognition of diplomas, recognition of skills, we talk about language, etc., etc. So of course there's multiple labor market sectors in Europe which are under pressure, whether it's healthcare or the transition to the green economy. In all those areas and many other aspects, in all those areas we need qualified workers, and the question is, how do we match the demand and the offer, while at the same time assuring that you do not deplete the countries of origin of the people that they need to build up their countries. So there is, of course, creative ideas needed, which exist. And I think if we would say transition to green economy, the need of solar panels, for example, both in Pakistan or in Nigeria and in the Netherlands and in Germany, can we not massively invest in skills development on this level in those countries of origin, have circular migratory movements which allow for this to grow and create win-win-win situations. Again, we're not there yet. It's also a very politically sensitive story. So not all countries are open for this.
We have heard in the last podcast that there are already a few agreements with India on the way. What's the status there?
Well, with India, there is of course some agreements between individual countries, between Germany and India, between Portugal and India, and several others. It's important that these are used wisely, making sure that people get equal opportunities and that those programs are successful. Failed programs always set bad examples and scare people away, so they need to be well prepared, well planned, to make sure that we draw the right conclusions to get this working. And we are working closely with India and with individual European countries, as well as with the European Commission, to make sure that this cooperation strengthens.
Moving on to
Turkey, I would like to go, if you don't mind, the impact of the earthquake. It's well known that there are some 4 million Syrians under temporary protection in Turkey, hundreds of thousands of labor migrants, irregular migrants, refugees in the country, and many of them were living in the area hit by the earthquake. Just for comparison, this area is roughly as big as the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg combined, the size of Austria, basically, where more than 10 million, some 12 million people live, including 1.8 million Syrians on temporary protection, living in cities, in camps, but most of them in cities. And of course, the earthquake hit at the worst possible time, middle of the night, 4 o'clock in the morning, followed by a very heavy earthquake a few hours later during the day. The scale is enormous. It will have a long-lasting, multi-annual impact on Turkey and its institution. It will cause internal movement, displacement of people, Turks as well as migrants. Turkey has allowed Syrians on a temporary protection, which normally were allowed to stay only in a certain province, to move to other provinces. So we see already that those who can and have the means moving mainly westwards, north and westwards. There's estimates that 3 to 5 million Turks will have to look for temporary shelter elsewhere, creating, of course, tensions in the new populations. They need to find housing, they need to find jobs, they need to find schooling, etc., etc., etc. Already before the earthquake, there was 10,000 Syrians with special needs living in that region. All of these things has now just been made worse. We need to make sure that international community, which was already very fast in its response for the emergency rescue, to also ensure that there is generous contribution in the reconstruction of Turkey and the offering of shelter. We as ICPD are working very closely with the Presidency for Migration Management, with the Director General for Provincial Administration, which takes care of the management of the work in the provinces, but also at the borders, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to see how can we strengthen them in doing their work. And the needs are from providing shelter to food to longer term needs. How can we support them in management of these flows? The challenges are enormous, but first and foremost in the country. We of course see the earthquake has hit also Syria very hard. The border area with Turkey, thousands and thousands of people have passed away there, died during the earthquake. We don't know at all the extent there. The figures are probably vastly underestimated. Turkey has made clear that they will of course support any kind of emergency aid which has to go into Syria, which creates challenges at the border. The roads are not good. Border crossing points need to be established and managed. You see Syrians who want to go back. They want to go back into Syria to help out there, to look for relatives and loved ones, to bury them, but also because they just have lost hope in Turkey. Now they go back after first being displaced by the war, now by the earthquake. You see that there is some initial movement back into Syria. Talk about hundreds, not yet thousands of people, but there is people going back also. The long-term impact of potential migration, for example, into Europe, needs to be seen. It's not that there is now immediate need or interest of people now to leave Turkey and go to Europe. It's also not that the doors are open. It's also not that it's just easy to walk now into Greece or Bulgaria onwards. But there's also not a big interest. The first thing is to find relief, to find shelter, and to feel protected in the country where you come from. The generosity of the Turkish population is enormous, of course, towards their own population. We see some tensions in some communities where there was the impression that some of the migrants got more support than the population there. That is being addressed very consciously to make sure that there is no feeling of some people getting preferential status over others. There's some misinformation going around, but also here there's active awareness against that, on that, and there's actions against that.
How difficult overall is the cooperation with Syria for the international community?
Well, the difficulty, of course, is that you talk about, and it's more complicated than I put it now, but there is an area which is under control of the Syrian authorities and an area not under control of the Syrian authorities. And that area which is not under control is also mixed. So, of course, it is difficult for relief organizations to be present in both. So many relief organizations say, okay, I work in that area, the other have said we work in the other area. For the emergency aid, there is now, it starts to come. Unfortunately, too late probably to save many lives under the rubble, but not too late to bring relief, at least some relief, to the people who live under very difficult circumstances, extremely cold at the moment. There's no basic facilities, etc., etc. So some relief is coming. What we need to see is to what extent reconstruction will happen and who will start investing in reconstruction in a country which has still, for a large part, under the Assad regime, and another part which is not controlled by a central government. So very challenging.
Now looking again at the more practical issues also of your work in Turkey. You're running really many projects there. Will the projects continue the way they used to be, or are you already planning to redirect funding towards other activities?
Well, I mean, the funding as such is, of course, not coming. It's not coming from humanitarian funds. So what we did after the so it will not go into emergency relief, but of course we are looking at every individual project, whether that is on protection, on return, on border management, on fight against trafficking, and migration development, many other projects that we're doing. We're having a large program supporting social inclusion of Syrians, which is a small entrepreneurship program. All of those will have to adjust their activities. We have hundreds and hundreds of partners who received grants from us living in that area via EU funding. We, of course, are trying to reach them and try to work with them how they can restart their business, strengthen their businesses. Maybe we can look into alternative ways of making sure that we can do. But we are now making the assessment, every individual project, how we can adjust it and in a way that we can contribute to the work that we need to be doing in Turkey.
That's very, very challenging, I believe. Anything else on Turkey that you think is important to mention?
No, I think because otherwise I fall into I repeat myself. I think what is of course important is the cooperation along the whole route, so also in the Western Balkans. There, of course, we have seen quite some discussion last year on alignment of visa policies, for example, from Serbia with the EU visa lists. That is happening or has happened by now. Serbia has tightened its visa regulations, which might curb some of the regular flows via the Western Balkan routes. At the moment, the challenge is in particular to support the national authorities in strengthening, modernizing, professionalizing their migration management capacities. Of course, many of the migrants who travel via the Western Balkans entered the Western Balkans via an EU country, via Bulgaria, via Greece, and they want to travel onwards to other EU countries. So, of course, this creates a very particular situation which needs different forms of cooperation of those countries with the EU Asylum Agency, with Frontex, with us and with others to make sure that we take that particular location and situation into consideration when working with them on different areas of migration management.
Okay, you've already mentioned routes. When we think of major irregular migration routes, also the Mediterranean route comes to mind. So maybe that's also a good opportunity to look at what's happening in the Med region in 2023, presumably.
Yeah, so let's approach the Med region also from the perspective of the existing migration relationships that already existed with those countries. Many of the North African countries, but also Jordan and Lebanon, have large diaspora communities in Europe. Legal migration, family formation, family reunification, labor migration, a long history exists between Europe and the partner countries in the Mediterranean, which are to a large extent very positive. At the same time, of course, there is quite some transit migration via the Mediterranean, very often under very dangerous circumstances. We just now, actually yesterday, another boat with over 70 migrants went missing. So we see constant dramas on the Mediterranean where people lose their life. Our approach in the Mediterranean is that all those countries are key partners in both migration governance with regard to their own citizens or diaspora, but also with regard to the management of irregular flows, but also in offering protection. So we say we have started initiatives to professionalize and modernize the capacities of our partners in that region. This means, for example, that we have established a training institute in Malta, a fully certified training institute where we train trainers from those countries on specific topics related to migration governance. This can be document security or general migration governance, but also adult training, which means that there is we can offer certain standards, guarantees that the trainings are delivered according to the highest educational standards. It's registered in the European system, so we can make sure you get your points.
And these are aimed at professionals that work in the field of migration, right?
Yes, exactly. So we target particular groups of professionals who will then get certified training and can also themselves, if they are educated as trainers, deliver trainings which are again certified. So the trainees will get a certified diploma. This helps us in the professionalization of these agencies. And of course, at the same time, we should also invest in the modernization. Modernization, always people think this is just investing in border management, which is partly important, but it's also investing in the modernization of migration governance agencies, modernization in standards, human rights standards, modernization in procedures, making sure that the migration management authorities in those countries deliver services according to the highest standards, meaning that they can process can offer status determination according to higher standards than has been done in the past.
Now, looking again at the 2023 outlook, apart from the training center, which is a great and positive development, generally, is there also an overarching theme applicable to this area?
Well, there is one overarching theme, and of course that's the rising cost of living, which has different aspects and different impacts in different countries. But we see that the economies in some of the countries are badly affected. Egypt and Tunisia. We have, of course, the security situation in Libya. We see also the pressure on Lebanon, which of course has had to deal with multiple crisis over the last years of different nature. We have Jordan, which is still hosting a large population of refugees, just like like Lebanon from Syria. So there is, combined with increased prices, high inflation rates, this of course creates different forms of pressure. This does not necessarily need to lead to the conclusion that this will be a massive increase in migration, but it does increase certain pressures. We have people who are higher educated, but have less opportunities at home. And of course, those will start looking for opportunities at home. Legally, many of them, but not always.
Right. And if we move now to our other African regions, Pan-Africa.
Well, if we would like maybe first go to West Africa, here we see that there's a number of crises developing. We of course have had a number of coup d'etat in West Africa. We have the insecurity, for example, in Burkina Faso, which is pushing people around. We have potential of extremists trying to disrupt the democracies in quite a number of West African countries. We have the elections in Nigeria in the coming weeks, 2 rounds which are coming up. Depending on the outcome and the handling of the outcome, the acceptance of the process, this might or might not lead to further unrest. We see, of course, that there is quite a number of there's the high prevalence of human trafficking in the region via Nigeria and to Niger and then onwards. So we have to also here be very conscious about the situation in the region. Most of the migration, both forced and voluntary, takes place within West Africa. So there is lots of movement between the different countries, to Nigeria, to Cote d'Ivoire, from Senegal to Senegal, etc. So there is a lot of movement in the region. Of course, it's the ECOWAS region. There is some potential spillover in other regions, in percentage-wise, fairly limited towards Europe in absolute numbers. Of course, it's quite high numbers. But again, compared to, for example, Asia, the number of migrants from West Africa is of course lower in absolute numbers. Also because the route they have to take is, of course, much more complicated.
And moving to the last of your regions.
If we look at Africa itself, Africa as a whole, there our cooperation focuses mainly on the support to migration dialogues. Khartoum process, where we bring European countries together with East African countries, and the Rabat process, where we bring European countries together with West African countries. Here, for us, it's very important to keep, to support the respective chairs of those processes in keeping certain topics very high on the agenda, whether that's the fight against trafficking, whether that is the impact of global warming. We always try to facilitate this regional cooperation, to create understanding via those dialogues, to make sure that we keep the international migration diplomacy going. Informal and formal dialogues and contacts are, in the end, let's say, the oil in the machine. Many people talk about the migration dialogues, which like we also have towards the east via the Budapest and Prague processes, as it's talk shops. First of all, that's not true, because there's a lot of important experiences and knowledge and insights shared, but there's also a lot of networks being established. So if we would only have these dialogues, yes, it would lead to some improvement. But if you combine those dialogues and the conclusions of the dialogues with targeted capacity building and institution building cooperation, you can really make migration on a multilateral and a bilateral level function much better.
This was the kind of a perfect closing already. We've talked for almost an hour. Dear Martijn, it was extremely insightful, and we could only touch upon very general and I would say also shallow topics this time, because we had to cover half of the globe basically that is under your directorate. Wishing you good luck also for 2023. Lots of challenges coming your way.
Indeed, many challenges, also many opportunities. I still hope that we can see progress in facilitating multilateral and bilateral partnerships, true partnerships, listening very carefully to the needs of all the partners involved in these discussions, that we look at labor market opportunity, labor migration opportunities, skills development. All of these aspects are essential to focus on, to, let's say, the other forms of migration management, migration governance, as I would like to call it, that are needed. I think there's many things that we are not yet aware of, which will unfortunately probably happen this year, but let's keep the hopes up.
Thank you very much. Joining me today was Martijn Ploem, ICMPD Director, Migration Dialogues and Cooperation. Today we learned that migration is complex and that each region has their particular challenges, even though many issues are interconnected. And many thanks for being with us today and for tuning in, and see you next time. Stay up to date on ICMPD's activities and visit our website icmpd.org, sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media.